Okay, hello everyone. Hope you're doing well. It is, let me see if I can get my dates right. It is what? I have to look. October 7th already. How did that happen? And it's a Wednesday evening. Anyway, I hope everyone's doing well. Thanks for those of you who've been in email contact. It's great to hear. And, for those who haven't been in contact for a while, please reach out and let me know how you're doing. Let me know how I can help in any way. Just some announcements um, for you. Most of these you have seen already. First of all, I updated the syllabus, which is now on Canvas. It's just some, pretty small changes really. I switched a couple of lectures around, as you already know, for the virology lecture. So I hope you enjoyed Dr. Beering's presentation. It seemed quite relevant considering the global pandemic that we are experiencing and have been experiencing, continue to experience. Today we're just going to carry on with self-function. As part of that syllabus change, oh, by the way, that updated syllabus is now available on Canvas. So it's updated syllabus underscore October, updated October. So as part of that syllabus change, there will be no class on October 14th, which is a week from today. And so I just, it felt like it's good, to have a gap day where you don't have a lot, we won't have lecture. I'll still be available for office hours if you want to meet here on the Zoom link, or at any time. I will be around pretty much most of that day. So please let me know if you want to chat. That same week, the week of October 12th, which is next Monday, that is the week where I would like you to go out to a natural reserve. And I'll elaborate more on that on Monday, some ideas, but we've already talked about some locations you can have in mind. Wind Wolves Preserve being one that's very close to Bakersfield and is open to the public. Hart Park isn't truly a natural preserve, but there's some pretty cool native habitats in the area surrounding that. And hey, just, places, like out around Taft, there's some pretty cool habitat around there. I know there's not a lot of native habitat on the San Joaquin Valley floor, but we live in pretty, going up Kern Canyon, any number of like little turnoffs off of Kern Canyon on the way to Kernville and Lake Isabella, on the road up to Alta Sierra. There's lots of places even up north, pushing toward Visalia, anything that's kind of unaltered. I know the national forests and the national parks are all closed right now during because of wildfires. So please don't go to any place that's closed because of the pandemic or because of wildfires, but there's plenty of places besides that you can get to that are relatively close to Bakersfield. We really do live in a pretty special place for proximity to some cool native habitat. So I'd recommend Wind Wolves Preserve, Hart Park, Kern Canyon, Lake Isabella, the road that leads up to Alta Sierra. You can come, down to my neck of the woods around Frazier Park, pushing up towards Mount Pinos. There's some pretty cool habitat up in that direction. And if for folks who are, not living in Bakersfield right now, and I know there's some folks in the class who are from out of state, feel free to go anywhere that's native habitat. Up towards Tehachapi, I'm just trying to pick some local examples. There's lots of cool stuff around Tehachapi. So those are just some ideas. I'm not saying a national park or anything like that. I'll give specific sort of what you'll actually do there on Monday. But yes, keep that in mind for next week, which is the week of October 12th. There's not going to be any class that Wednesday evening, but any extra time plan on making a trip on your own time for that lab. And then I know I'm pushing 2 weeks ahead now, but just to put it on your radar, we're going to have a review session for exam 2 on October 19th, which I believe is a Monday. It's either a Monday or Wednesday. What I went ahead and did, there were like 5 folks who participated last time. I really would like more. I would like more folks to come if possible. So we're going to do it the democratic method. I put a poll on Canvas. It's under the quiz section. It's the modular is actually a quiz, but it's not a quiz. There shouldn't be a point value. Basically click on it. It's going to look like a quiz on the outside. Pick the time frame on October 19th that you can make it. And that would be the best way to go about it. Because it is a quiz, the Canvas is limited in that sense. I can't do an actual poll. If you click on something, it might, when you submit it, it'll show a wrong answer, but don't worry. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It's just the only way that I can get a poll out to everyone. So don't worry, it's not a quiz. But fill out that poll. I think I gave you a few days to do it, but it's all of one question. So please go ahead and fill that out. And have one of those time slots available. The one that has the most availability, where most folks are available, that's the one that we will do for the live review session on October 19th. And just as a reminder, in Unit 2, the microbiology section of the class we're in right now, the exam itself will be on biochemistry and macromolecules, cell structure. So we've done these first 3 here so far. Well, 4 actually. We've done virology and epidemiology, and cell function, cell life cycle. We're still going toward that, and then ultimately microscopy, which has been where our labs have been focused on in this unit, as well as a little bit of epidemiology, like this week's lab. So, please, for the review session, fill in the poll for when you will be available. And then secondly, for the review session itself, please bring questions. I don't have anything prepared for the day, but we can go over anything that you like, go over questions, things like that. I can bring up past PowerPoint slides, whatever you want. You're the boss during that time. So that's what that's for. And then the exam itself will be, I guess that means October 19th is a Monday, it has to be. October 21st is the day of the exam from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m., just like last time. Okay, so recap on cell structure, which was a week and a half ago now. We had that virology lecture in between. So just to refresh ourselves about what we talked about for cells and their structure. Question 1, I know this really works better if we were all in a room together, but we'll make do. What is the name for the internal areas of cells not taken up by organelles? Okay, so we talked about eukaryotic cell structure, and we talked about how these different anatomical features within eukaryotic cells, we call those organelles, right? But what about the spaces within the cell that are not organelles? We called those spaces cytosol or cytoplasm. Okay, so those 2 terms are interchangeable. So if we look at this electron microscope picture right here, here is the plasma membrane / cell membrane. These are also 2 terms that can be used interchangeably. That separates the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell. So outside, inside. So inside of the cell, there's a mix of different organelles, but within a spot that's not an organelle, this aqueous liquid here inside, that is called either the cytosol or the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is more commonly used, generally speaking. What is the function of ribosomes? It's one of the organelles we talked about that plays a very important role in all cells, really. And we went ahead and said that the function of ribosomes is to synthesize proteins. They're protein factories, okay? So there are many there are many ribosomes in a particular cell. This is an artist's rendition of what one looks like. Ribosomes in and of themselves are proteins. I know that's a bit confusing, but it's a protein making other proteins, but this blue thing here is meant to represent what a protein looks like. And then we'll talk about this process in Unit 3 of how DNA is converted into protein language, but this is the actual site of a protein being made. DNA coming in, or RNA coming in on one side, and proteins coming out another. So the literal function of a ribosome is to synthesize proteins. Which organelle is not part of the endomembrane system? Remember, the endomembrane system is this, actually, it's not a single organelle, but it's actually a series of organelles that I felt was just a little bit too many moving pieces to memorize for the context of this unit. So I just went ahead and posited to you this broader thing called the endomembrane system. And we define various organelles that are a part of that, things like the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, the lysosomes. All of these are different organelle types that are broadly involved in repackaging and distributing various cellular products around the cell and even outside of the cell. And so they're the Uber of the cell in quotation marks. And so that's the endomembrane system. Okay, but multiple organelles there. So that leaves this one left. The cytoskeleton is not part of the endomembrane system. The cytoskeleton is shown here by these blue and pink structures here. That's basically the scaffolding inside of cells, also a couple of other functions that we'll actually talk about when we talk about cell division. But cytoskeleton, it's not part of the endomembrane system. Which is not a difference between plants and animal cells. Okay, so we talked about organelles that are distinct for plant cells that do not occur in animal cells. All of these are eukaryotic, both plants and animals, but plant cells have some organelles that do not occur in animal cells. Things like cell walls, which I know is a bit confusing because that sounds like a cell membrane, but they're actually very different structures in terms of their structure and function. Cell walls are made of cellulose. It's a carbohydrate that is broadly involved in helping cells keep their shape and helps give a lot of plants their rigidity. It's what wood is made out of. So that's an organelle that is distinct to plant cells. Vacuoles are structures inside the center of plant cells that are involved in the storage of water and other solutes, salts and sugars and things like that, but mostly water. So what helps give plants their shape. If you think of the cell wall as like the rubber part of a balloon, the vacuole is the air inside of it. It's kind of what helps keep plant cells inflated, and also helps plants keep their structure. And then of course, I'm sure you've heard of chloroplasts before, where the actual site of photosynthesis. That's where photosynthesis takes place. Certainly something that's distinct to plant cells. Okay, so that leaves over the cell membrane, which is a component in both plant and animal cells. So here's an idealized animal cell. It, of course, has a cell membrane. And then here is an idealized plant cell. It also has a cell membrane. It's underneath the cell wall. Okay, it should be labeled here. There it is. Well, there's the cell wall, and the cell membrane is actually not labeled here on the plant cell, but it's there underneath the plasma membrane, right, kind of like right there. Okay, so cell membranes are both in plant and animal cells. Oh, one more question. The cell membrane is comprised of which types of biological macromolecules? Okay, so we talked about how cell membranes are very crucial organelle type that basically separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And we talked about how there's some different names for the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, also the phospholipid bilayer. So, phospholipids are, of course, a type of lipid. So does that mean that's what the cell membrane is? Well, no. Lipids are by far the majority component of cell membranes, but there are other things that are embedded into the cell membrane. So these green things here are meant to represent the phospholipids, the phospholipid bilayer we're actually seeing here. So if you think of the cell membrane as a sea or an ocean, of course, the water in the ocean is the majority component, but there's different things floating in it. Same thing for the cell membrane. The phospholipids in the cell membrane are the majority component, but there's other things floating in it that are also part of the cell wall, or the cell membrane, sorry. So things like proteins that act as really important conduits for how things enter cells and leave cells. Also things like carbohydrates that attach to the proteins, and cholesterols, which are also, which are actually nucleic acids. All of these things are part of the cell membrane, but by far the majority component is certainly this phospholipid, the green stuff here. Okay, with all that said, that's all cell structure, and I know that's a fair amount of nuance. I'm sure you've heard a lot of those terms before when you took high school biology. That may be a little bit more detailed than you've covered in high school biology. I know it's a little bit of memorization, and certainly memorization is not the goal of the class for you to memorize a bunch of stuff, but it is important. You have these things in every one of your cells, and so your body functions thanks to them. So that's why we are studying them. They are important. Another thing I'll mention before I dive into cell function for today is that I threw up a different video on Canvas it's from a website called Khan Academy, and you can actually go to the Khan Academy website now. It's a lot more intricate than it used to be. It used to be just a page on YouTube, and I kind of miss those simple old days where Sal Khan, the namesake of the website, he just did videos, and they were on that black screen, and they're really simple, and he's an excellent lecturer. He's very good at explaining things in a very succinct, clear way. And so back when I was an undergraduate, I saved all of his videos and I downloaded them directly from YouTube. And so that's what I'm giving you. There's a cell structure video from Sal Khan on Canvas. Watch that. He goes into some more detail than I go into. I go into more details that he doesn't go into. You're only responsible for what I discuss in lecture. But that resource that Khan gives out there, that video that's now on Canvas, is a useful study tool for you. It's certainly a good supplement. And of course, the textbook as well. There will be others. I'll post other videos from Sal as the semester goes on. Cell division, another kind of complex process. And so I hope that supplementary video can provide a good alternative in case the way I'm trying to explain it to you just isn't jiving. That can be a good alternative for you. So today we're going to dive into cell function. We've talked about the structure of cells. Now let's talk about broadly what those different, in a certain sense, cells as a whole, how they function, which is found in chapter 5 of your textbook. Okay, and just like with cell structure, we're only going to talk about eukaryotic cell function. Okay, so last time, if you remember, when we were talking about cell structure, we differentiated between prokaryotic cells, which are the bacteria, and the archaea, which are very important cells. I'm not skipping over them because they're less important. In fact, they're very important, but we just don't have the time. They're relatively simple and smaller in size. We're not talking about them other than to acknowledge that they exist. We, for the most part, spent our time talking about eukaryotic cells. And so, things like you and I, animals, fungi, plants, protists, which are really simple algae. These are all eukaryotic cells. And so all of the different organelles we've been talking about, these are all features that are found in these different types of organisms. Okay, so we're going to focus, just like in terms of cell structure, we're going to focus on eukaryotic cells in terms of their function. We're not going to talk as much about processes that you would see only in prokaryotic cells. Now, these processes that we'll talk about, you would also see them in prokaryotic cells. These things that we're talking about aren't all exclusive to eukaryotic cells. But we're talking, from here going forward, assume that everything that we're talking about is eukaryotic in nature. Okay, so two major cell functions, and these harken back a little bit to the properties of life way back from the first lecture. Okay, so this is already, I'm already limiting ourselves. You can, you know, draw many more cell functions than this, but I'm limiting to these two because these are very crucial, very broad level functions that cells engage in. So first of all, cells have to have a way of obtaining and using energy in order to function. Sort of self-explanatory. We'll talk a little bit about how that works. And secondly, they have to have a way of eating, okay? They have to have a way of taking nutrients in, and they have to have a way of getting rid of wastes, okay? Cells are organisms too, okay? Just like you and me. Some organisms only are one cell large, like unicellular organisms. They have to eat too, and they produce waste, and so they have to have a way of getting rid of that waste. That's broadly membrane transport. It's involved in taking things across the cell membrane and getting things on the other side, pushing out across the cell membrane. So that's also a very important thing that cells have to engage in. Obviously, they want to take the good stuff in, but they don't want bad stuff to get in. And certainly, they want to put the bad stuff out, the waste, but they don't want the good stuff to get out. And so membrane transport across the cell membrane has to be regulated in a fairly distinct way in order for this to be successful. And so that's another major function of cells that they engage in. So energy and function, we're firstly going to focus on energy. Okay, so work and energy, this is a little bit harkening back to physics. So if anyone is a physics inclined person or is taking a physics class, you'll recognize these terms, and this is very broad, certainly not the level of detail that you would get in a physics class. But let's just differentiate between work and energy. And these are the technical definitions of these two terms, not the colloquial definitions. I don't mean going to work from 9 to 5, and I don't mean, oh, I don't have any energy right now. The actual physical scientific description of what these two terms mean. Okay, so work, in terms of a technical definition, is any action that moves matter that the matter would not move otherwise. So when I pick up my coffee mug here, okay, I am doing work, okay, by lifting it up high. Because if I didn't wrap my head around the coffee mug and lift it up, the coffee mug wouldn't move by itself. Okay, it doesn't have any energy in and of itself in terms of its structure to move on its own, right? It's an inanimate object. And so in order for the coffee cup to move, I have to grab it myself. I have energy in my body, and I can force the coffee cup to move. By doing that, I am doing work. I am engaging in work by forcing the coffee cup to move. It wouldn't move by itself. Okay, so that's the technical definition of work. On the flip side of that, these two terms are not exclusive to one another. Energy is the capacity to perform work. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more, you know, in the coming slides about what that looks like. That'll help make this more sense. So work is the action of moving matter when it wouldn't move otherwise, and energy is the capacity to do work. Okay, it's the, you know, and that can be defined in a bunch of different ways. It can be defined in terms of calories and you know, force and other things. Okay, so there's two kinds of energy. Okay. And if this were a physics class, I'm sure physicists would disagree with me and they say, oh, no, it's not that simple. There's more than two kinds of energy. But this is not a physics class. And so I'm simplifying it a little bit, in part to cover my own lack of physical knowledge. It's been a while since I've taken a physics class. So we're just going to keep it at two. There's two kinds of energy. The first kind of energy is called potential energy. And so this is the energy that is stored in an object due to its location in space or its chemical structure. So it's not something that is actually, you know, manifesting in energy in the colloquial definition of the word, but it's where it's located in space. So for example, going back to my coffee mug here, when the coffee mug, well, I can actually do this. The coffee mug is sitting here on the edge of the table, just like this, okay? So it's on top of the table, but if I were to push it off the edge, the coffee mug would, of course, fall to the ground and shatter, and I'd lose all my tea. And I don't want to do that. However, because it is sitting here on top of the table, it has a potential energy, because if this coffee cup were to, if the table were to disappear from under it, the coffee cup would fall to the ground, and it has energy because of its elevation, its position in space. And so the coffee mug has potential energy because of its position. Another form of potential energy is the actual chemical structure of a type of molecule. We'll talk about an example about that in a second. It's easier to show a picture. And then the second type of energy is kinetic energy. So this is energy in motion. Okay, so that can be a car driving down the road, or it can be flame or lightning. There's a bunch of different types of kinetic energy even into itself. But energy is energy. Kinetic energy is energy of motion. And if you think about it in this sense, kinetic energy is potential energy manifest, if that makes sense. So going back to my coffee mug here, it has potential energy when it's sitting here on the tabletop. But if I were to push it off the side of the table and it would fall to the ground, that potential energy would be converted to kinetic energy. It's moving, it's falling on the ground, and then it shatters. Okay, and I don't want that to happen, but kinetic energy is the manifestation of a potential energy. Same thing if potential energy is stored in the chemical composition of an object, like think batteries. Okay, there's a lot of chemical energy in a battery, but when you plug that battery in, and that's potential, when you plug that battery into, I don't know, an alarm clock or something, and it begins to work, that is now kinetic energy. That energy is moving out of its mere potential state. Okay, so another definition is kinetic energy is manifest potential energy. So here's some examples. Another example of potential versus kinetic energy. Sorry, I gotta drink my tea. If we're here at the beach and there's a lot of public places used to have these flotillas out, like Carpinteria, for example, used to have these flotillas out, 100 yards or so. You could swim out to them and you could dive off. Most public beaches have removed these because people aren't very smart and they get hurt and then they try to sue the city. So you won't see very many of these anymore. But maybe some places they still have them. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. Imagine this flotilla is out off the coast somewhere. Let's say it's Carpinteria, and there's a bunch of folks playing around on the flotilla. Okay, it's got a ladder and it's got a diving board that people are having fun diving into the ocean. Okay, so as someone is here at the base of the ladder, okay, and they begin to climb, doop, 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 up to the top. Okay, so this person is climbing, and that person probably is going to fall off and get hurt and maybe sue the city. I don't know. But as these two people are climbing up, their potential energy is increasing because they're getting higher and higher and higher. So you might say that these two people are in the state of increasing potential energy. And let's just say they're sitting still, they're not moving. Okay, so they're just kind of hanging out there on the ladder. Okay, so they are in a state of potential energy. And these two folks that are here at the top of the ladder, they are also in a state of potential energy, but they're at the top, so that they've maximized their potential energy. They can't get any higher. Okay, so they're standing on the top here, and then eventually, and then there's these other people here. All of these people are in a state of potential energy, but then eventually these people are going to be jumping off. Okay, they've reached their maximum potential, and then they jump off toward the ocean, and hopefully don't get hurt, and hopefully don't sue the city. And eventually, by doing that, they are converting their potential energy to kinetic energy. Okay, so that's one example. Another example is, this is positional potential energy. In other words, another example is, you're riding a bicycle, and you come to a hill, and you have to put in a lot of extra work. Remember, work is the actual effort of moving an object against its will, in this case, the bike and your body. So you're actually having to put in a lot of extra work in order to get up the hill. If you've ever ridden a bike uphill, you know what I'm talking about. So your energy in, and then when you reach the top of the hill, you're done putting in the work. You've reached a state of maximum potential energy. But then when you go down the hill, you don't have to work nearly as hard because it's pure kinetic energy. You don't have to work anymore because it's manifesting in the work you did to reach a state of high potential energy. And then chemical potential energy. I waited to show you a picture because it's you know, there's these two types, positional, which we've been talking about here and here. But then chemical potential energy is another type of potential energy that is stored energy on the basis of the chemical composition of matter, okay? So that it's arrangement of atoms. And this gets back to the different types of bonds that we talked about. Remember, covalent bonds, ionic bonds, and hydrogen bonds. Bonds that are really strong. So the bonds that we talked about that are the strongest, covalent bonds, really strong bonds, have a lot of potential chemical energy in them. Relatively weak bonds, like the bonds that are in water, they don't have a lot of chemical potential energy stored in them. Okay, so one type of very high chemical potential energy that has a lot of very strong covalent bonds are the bonds that you'd see in these long hydrocarbon chains that's typical of gasoline. Okay, so here's kind of an artist's rendition of a gasoline molecule. Okay, so you know the stuff that obviously we all know what gas is. You know, that we put into our cars. Petroleum is the more apt term. Okay, if you just have it sitting in one of those big red canisters in your garage, it has high chemical potential energy. It's not going to do much. But if you do some kind of action to it that causes those bonds to begin to break, as those high energy bonds break, they release a lot of energy, as you can imagine. So don't do this at home, but if you take some gasoline and you put a match in it, what's going to happen? Well, that gasoline is going to light up. It has a lot of chemical potential energy stored in it because of its chemical nature. Okay, and of course, that's the same exact phenomenon that we use to drive our cars. Okay, so you put a petroleum inside your car. Your car is basically your car engine is basically a way of exploding your gas in a safe way that can force your car to do work, to move. That's why we call it the combustion engine. It's basically exploding the gas in a very controlled way so that the pistons of your car can move and drive the car forward. Okay, so chemical potential energy is one other type of potential energy. Okay, just some more examples. What type of potential energy does this mousetrap have? Okay, well, as you can imagine, we have two types of potential energy, positional and chemical. Well, you might be able to imagine, let's assume that this trap is armed and that this spring has a lot of tension in it and that some poor critter comes along and triggers it. What's going to happen? Well, it's going to obviously activate. And so there's a lot of positional potential energy stored in this spring for a mousetrap. Okay, it's being restrained by the hook here, but that's an example of positional potential energy. Obviously, if the critter comes along and hits the activation plate and the awful trap of death is activated, that is transferred into kinetic potential energy. So this mousetrap has positional potential energy, whereas this apple, as you can imagine, is just sitting there. Let's just say it's on the ground and it doesn't have a lot of positional potential energy. But let's say you eat it and your body begins to break it down and use it for energy. Okay, so this energy, or this apple rather, has a lot of chemical potential energy. Okay, so we're slowly but surely getting towards something that we're going to call alive here shortly. We're just doing the necessary groundwork right now. Here's a depressing thought. Energy is really easily lost. Okay, so when you convert energy from one form to another, this is one of the laws of thermodynamics, if I'm not mistaken. Energy is neither created or destroyed, but it's easily lost. Okay, so if you convert energy from one form to another, a lot of the energy just dissipates into space, and you don't see it again. It's not created; it just goes somewhere else. Okay, so here's the depressing part. If you think about all the hard work that plants do in the context of photosynthesis, and we'll talk a little bit about photosynthesis when we get there, but all of the light energy that plants take in, and all the stuff that they do to make sugars that then you and I eventually eat, they only harness about 1% of that to make the sugars. The other 99% is just given off as back to the atmosphere as heat. Okay, another depressing example is that when your car burns gas, about 3/4 of that is simply lost as heat energy. that it is not energy that's actually translated to your car wheels moving and getting you from point A to point B, which is the purpose, right? Most of that energy, that chemical potential energy in petroleum, actually goes out of the car through heat, as you know, feel the hood of your car after you've driven it, and that's how it comes out. So you're basically paying to heat your engine up. That's why I've always said gas should be about 3/4 less expensive than it really is, because the energy that you're actually using to get yourself from point A to point B is only about 1/4 of what you're paying for. The other 3/4 is you're just heating your engine for no apparent reason. That's kind of a spurn a little bit, but I digress. It's a joke. About 3/4 of the energy is lost in the conversion of the chemical potential energy in your petroleum that you buy at the gas station to actually moving your car. And this same concept applies for electric cars. So if you're a Tesla fan, sorry, equally depressing. Okay, and this is basically showing the exact same thing as what we just talked about. When you burn gasoline in your car, and that car is converted to kinetic energy, driving your car forward. Most of that is given off as heat. We're not going to talk in detail about cellular respiration anymore, but the same thing. When you eat food, and your body breaks it down, and it gets all the way down to its base cellular process, the process of cellular respiration, where it's breaking this molecule. Actually, we'll talk about here shortly, ATP. You will see this again. When it actually goes through this process, most of that is given off as heat, and that heat is not useless. I mean, you know, we as mammals, of course, need the heat that our bodies produce in order for our physiology to work. But a lot of the heat our bodies don't use. You know, it just kind of gives it off directly. And so a lot of the food we eat is just given off as heat in our bodies that are not actually used to maintain our physical state, our biological state, in a broad sense. Oh, I'm talking about it sooner than I realized. Okay, so ATP here. I'm sure you've heard it before, but it's a very, 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 very important molecule. I will ask you to know what ATP means. So don't forget this. The primary source of cellular energy, if you want to think about it, the gasoline of cells, is this molecule called ATP. Okay, so it's a type of nucleic acid. If we get back to the 4 types of biological macromolecules, ATP is a type of nucleic acid, so it's lumped in there with things like DNA and RNA. Okay, so ATP is the gasoline of cells. It's what cells fill up their gas tanks with to actually do cellular work to drive kinetic energy in cells. And so ATP as a molecule right here, it has a lot of chemical potential energy in it. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and we'll you know, that basically means there's an adenine here, which is actually, you'll hear this term again, adenine, very important. And in another aspect, when it comes to DNA, remember ATP is a nucleic acid, so it has a somewhat similar chemical structure to DNA, but this adenine here, which is this blue thing, a ribose here, which you also would see in DNA. But then what's different relative to DNA are these 3 phosphate groups. That's why it's triphosphate, tri meaning 3. Okay, and this is the action end of ATP. Okay, so ATP as a molecule, it's a fairly complex, long molecule with a bunch of different atoms in it, different types of bonds. Okay, it has a lot of chemical potential energy. And the high potential energy comes from these 3 phosphate groups here. Okay, they are all, look at these O negatives here, these negatively charged oxygens. Okay, you know, like, have you ever heard the term in chemistry, like dissolves like? And opposites attract. And I'm getting back to basic chemistry here. We didn't really talk about those concepts in great detail. But broadly speaking, things of a different charge do not want to be, things of a same charge do not want to be too close to one another. 2 protons tend to not want to get too close to one another. Electrons, 2 electrons do not want to get too close to one another. It's one of the base characteristics of matter. Okay, so these 3 phosphate groups are actually really negatively charged. Okay, and so in order to force these 3, this is actually the process of photosynthesis. It's, you know, forcing these phosphate groups together. It takes a lot of energy to smush these 3 phosphate groups together. Okay, so if you can imagine, these 3 phosphate groups, they hate each other. They don't want to be around each other. They want to break free. Okay, so that's why ATP is the gasoline of cells. So when your body actually gets to the point where it breaks down ATP and it goes through a process called ATP hydrolyzation, which is shown right here, it breaks off one of those phosphate groups. Just like with gasoline, when you break these bonds where these 3 phosphate groups do not want to be together, when you break one of those off, a lot of energy is released. And in a broad sense, with a few really weird exceptions, we're not going to talk about those. For the most part, most of life as we know it fuels their cellular processes through this process of breaking off the phosphate group and hydrolyzing an ATP. Okay, so ATP is extremely important. We wouldn't be alive without it, and it has to do with these 3 phosphate groups here. So I know that's a little bit of chemistry, and some of you might balk at the idea of chemistry, but because of its huge biological importance, I do want you to know what ATP is. Okay, and I do want you to know that ATP means adenosine triphosphate, and I'd like you to know further, I might ask you this in an essay question, for example. I'd like you to know further that the reason why ATP is so important, the reason, how it functions for cells to give them their energy is because of these 3 phosphate groups. They don't like each other, they're all negatively charged, but when you break one off through ATP hydrolyzation, there's a lot of energy that is released, apparently about 3.7 kilocalories per mole per ATP molecule. Okay, so that's something that biochemists have come up with. So very, very important, everyone. I know it's a little bit of chemistry there, but extremely important for life. Life would not be possible without it. Okay, so what actually uses ATP in the cell? Okay, in other words, what does the work inside of cells? Okay, if you want to think of ATP as the petroleum of cells, what's the engine of cells? And the answer, you already know the answer. The answer is proteins, one of the biological macromolecules we've talked about. Proteins are what actually take the energy in ATP and use that to do the billions of different processes that occur inside your cells. Cells are extremely complex. They're like huge cities, okay? We're just glossing the surface in terms of structure and function here. But proteins are the actual, motors of cellular work, okay? So they use the petroleum, the petroleum of cells, ATP, to do that work. Okay, and there's billions of different functions, many different kinds of proteins, as we've already discussed. So for example, here are muscle proteins here, and this is the actual process by which muscle fibers in your body go about contracting and enabling you to do work with your body. Okay, and so these are actually long protein filaments, actin and myosin. If anyone is a health person, and maybe you've heard these before, but what actually gives actin and myosin the capacity to contract against one another and pull in a certain direction and cause them to do work? Well, ATP. ATP is hydrolyzed and the energy is given off that enables your muscles to contract. Interestingly, one of the people on my guidance committee for my PhD is a muscle physiologist, and she was telling me the other day that this actin and myosin idea is actually more of a theory. I learned this. I learned actin and myosin. That's how muscles contract, but apparently it's not. The science behind that is not 100% robust. But I digress there. Okay. Another example is membrane transport. We'll talk a little bit about this. But proteins that are embedded into the cell membrane, they have to have a way of differentiating between getting things inside the cell, solutes inside the cell, and pushing things outside the cell, which takes some work sometimes. It kind of goes against their potential energy. Kind of like when you're riding a bike uphill, you're going against the potential of gravity. And so you have to put in work in order to get that to happen. Same thing with proteins and how they move things across the cell membrane. They might be going against the potential of where solutes would want to go naturally. They have to do work in order to get them to go where they want them to go. And so ATP is used to help these proteins. It gives them the energy to transport solutes across the cell membrane. And then lastly, hugely important for chemical messaging, things like hormones, also proteins. Okay, we're going to come back to that, but I want to change gears here a little bit. We talked about energy in a really broad sense, and we've arrived at ATP. ATP is a hugely important molecule. It's the petroleum of cells. It's what gives most proteins in our bodies and all life the capacity to do cellular work. Okay, so you know, energy was the first aspect of cell function that I wished to talk about, and we will recircle to it back in other aspects of the class. But I want to change gears a little bit and talk about the other aspect of cell function, and that is, how do cells eat and how do they get rid of waste? So how is the flow of materials inside and outside, into cells and outside of cells regulated? So it's membrane transport. It's broadly talking about how cells get stuff across the cell membrane, the plasma membrane. Okay, so just to revisit back on some chemistry here. The solute and the solvent make up a solution. So this beaker of salt water here, the whole thing is a solution. The majority component of a solution is the solvent, okay, in this case the water, and the minority component is the solute, the stuff that's floating in, okay? So that is very important, and we talked about how life is a solution. Okay, if you want to think about it in kind of chemistry terms, where water's the solvent, and all of these different macromolecules that we've been talking about, proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, lipids, all of these different things we've been talking about, they are the solutes in the solvent of water. Okay, so life, the majority component of life is actually water, and all these other biological macromolecules, they're just floating around in the water. Okay, so macromolecules here, you know, so we've unpacked to a certain degree now how important water is in the function of life. The reason why is because it's the solvent. It's what mediates everything. It's hugely important, and you know, we've already gone into that to a certain degree, and we're going to do that more. Water really is the takeaway aspect of this whole unit. Okay, so sorry, getting ahead of myself here. So most, you know, when we're talking about cell transport or membrane transport, how cells get stuff from one side of the cell membrane to another, we're largely talking about a process that's mediated by water, because water is the solvent of life. Okay, so here's an artist's rendition again of the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, here's the outside of the cell. Here's the inside of the cell. Okay, so the cell is going to want to take in stuff from the outside that it considers good, you know, glucose and things like that it uses to break down and make ATP, for example. It wants to bring that inside of the cell for obvious reasons. That's its way of eating. But on the opposite side, the cell, it's a living thing. It produces wastes, and it doesn't want waste building up inside of its cell. It wants to get rid of it. It wants to expel the waste to outside of the cell. And so whether it's taking stuff that it wants inside or getting rid of stuff that it doesn't want and pushing it outside, this process of membrane transport across the cell membrane, it's all mediated by water. Okay, so water being really, really, really important. Okay, so life depends on the way water moves. And you know, if this were a chemistry class, we could talk a lot about water is quite a peculiar molecule. It's a really small molecule, of course. It's made up of an oxygen atom and 2 hydrogens, and it's highly polarized. The oxygen is really negative, and the hydrogens are pretty positive. So, you know, because of its really small size and its kind of obliquely polar nature, water actually behaves kind of weirdly in a chemical sense relative to most other things. And it, you know, as a consequence of that, that has huge implications for life. And we're not going to go into the intricate chemical details of why that is, but water is huge, okay? So basically, in the context of membrane transport, the way water moves is how life gets its stuff from one side of the cell membrane to another. Okay, so differences in water's potential for movement is what mediates all of this. So going back to potential energy, it's the stored energy in the substance based on its position in space or its chemical composition. So water is an object, or it's matter. Okay, so you know, if we want to talk about the potential energy of water, there's a really technical term for that that's called water potential. I was joking there. Water potential is just the potential energy of water, okay? Which basically is, think back to potential energy. It's basically where water will move based on where it's located or what it has inside of it. So it's positional or chemical, okay? And, you know, so water potential is merely the potential energy of water. It's just a shorthand of saying water's potential energy, okay? And so what I'm about to tell you over the next series of slides will be exceedingly easy if you can comprehend one thing right from the get-go. And this, you already know this, is that potential energy, doesn't matter what it is, potential energy always goes from a high state of potential energy to a low state of potential energy. So think about those people on the diving board. When they dive off, they are going from a high state of potential energy to a low state of potential energy. When you bike to the top of the hill and then you begin to ride down, you go from a high state of potential energy to a low state of potential energy. When you put gasoline in your car and you begin to drive a long distance trip, that chemical potential energy in your gas tank is continuously depleted, as we all know. Okay, so you're going from a state of high potential chemical energy to a state of, relatively speaking, low chemical potential energy. So everything I'm about to tell you, even though it sounds biologically intricate, always remember, potential energy always, always, always goes, unless there's something else happening, unless there's, unless there's something else acting on it, potential energy always goes from high to low. So in this example, where does this water have its potential? Okay, so where's the water potential in this picture here? Okay, so we're looking at a babbling brook, and it's going downstream. So the water is higher in elevation down here, and the water is moving in that direction, kind of down that way. Where is the water potential higher? As you might imagine, water potential always goes from high to low. So high potential energy is right here. The water has a higher gravitational position right here. As far as we know, water tends to move downhill. Okay, and that's an aspect of gravity. So, this is a river and it's moving downstream. Okay, so it's going from a state of high positional potential energy to a state of low positional potential energy. This is all water potential. Whoop, sorry. So where does this water have its potential? Up here, and that's why you see water moving downstream. Okay, so it's going from high to low. Okay, so water can have positional potential energy, as is shown here, but it can also have chemical potential energy on the basis of what is actually inside the water. Okay, water is the solvent of life. It generally doesn't exist in a pure state. Okay, so water's potential for movement can be dictated by its chemical composition. It's kind of its nature in solution. Okay, so this gets back to, and we'll show an example about this in a second. This is the actual process of osmosis. The process by which water moves across the cell membrane is in large part dictated by its chemical potential energy. And this always goes from high to low. So the process of osmosis, which is the process of water moving from one side of the cell membrane to the other. It's basically how cells drink and how cells eat. Is just water potential. It's dictated by its chemical nature. So the differences in the concentration of solvents on one side of the membrane versus the other. And I know this is, don't get worried if this sounds already a little bit intricate. It's not, because all you have to remember is that water potential always goes from a state of high potential energy to a state of low potential energy. That's it. If you know that, you know how to work this. Okay. So concentration gradients. Okay. Concentration gradients. If we go back to thinking about water as a solution, where water is the solvent and different things that are floating in the water are the solutes. Okay. When you have different concentration of solutes in water that are separated by something like a cell membrane, that's separating, that is setting up what's called a concentration gradient, where there's a higher concentration of some kind of solute versus on one side of the cell membrane versus the other. That is a gradient. A gradient is like a continuum with something from high, something to low. So that actual state of a concentration gradient is a difference in chemical potential energy. That constitutes a difference in chemical potential energy. And remember, potential energy always goes from high to low, okay? And so if you look at this schematic here, this is kind of an artist's rendition of an example of how this looks. This is kind of actually a pipe. This isn't really a cell, okay? But here's some kind of semi-permeable membrane. Let's go ahead and call this the cell membrane. And then we have, quote unquote, pure water on one side of the semi-permeable membrane, and then water that, let's just call it salt water, on the other, okay? So there's a difference in chemical potential energy between these two sides of the membrane, okay? Where is the potential energy? Remember, potential energy always goes from high to low. Generally speaking, okay, water's potential is higher where there is more water, okay? Let me say that again, because I know it's a bit weird. Water's potential is higher where there is more water, okay? And water potential always goes from high to low. Okay, it looks like there's more water here on the right side of the semi-permeable membrane, but there's not, because there's a bunch of solute. So there's actually less water on this side. It's a difference of concentration. So there's differences in chemical potential energy. So there's actually more water on this side. Water's potential is higher where there's more water. So where will water tend to move? Water always goes from high to low. Water will tend to move through the process of osmosis in this direction, always from high to low. So let's look at another example. Same thing. Let's say this is a cell, and this black dashed line here is a cell membrane, okay? And the blue dots represent water, and the red dots represent some kind of solute. Let's just call it sodium chloride to keep it simple, okay? So the process of osmosis, where water moves from one side of the cell to another, that's simply a process of high potential water potential to low water potential. So water's potential is higher where there is more water. Where is there more water? On the left side of the cell membrane or on the right side of the cell membrane? Well, looks to me like there's more water on the left side of the cell membrane. More water on this side. Water potential always goes from high to low energy. So where's the water going to go? I used to have an arrow pointing to it, but I'm just going to tell you it'll go this way. It'll go to the right. Okay. The reason why? High energy to low energy. The process of water movement will go this way. Okay. So if we were actually in class right now, this would be the prep lecture to do the osmosis lab, where we would actually put cells under different conditions to assess how water moves through the process of osmosis. And so I'm actually not going to bother with these terms right now, because there's going to be a separate way that I incorporate this. We can't do the osmosis lab, unfortunately, this semester. So I think that's enough material for now. Yes, we've talked about we've talked about cell structure and cell function in terms of energy and membrane transport. So these are two very broad ways that without them, cells would not have a capacity to do most of the things they do. So keep in mind, ATP and water think about recurring themes that I've said multiple times. Those are the important themes. With that said, let me know if you have any questions. Keep in mind that today I am an epidemiologist. Lab is in your biology lab notebook. It seems like a very relevant thing to do in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. So watch Dr. Beering's presentation beforehand, and let me know. Please reach out if you have any questions. With that, I'll sign off for the night, we'll see you again on Monday. Okay, so which would be October 12th, I believe, already somehow. All right, with that, I'm going to stop recording. Have a good one, everyone.